You'll have to bear with me while I tell you my story. So much of it is written from the hazy recollections of someone who was in captivity. Don't misunderstand. I wasn't abused in the traditional sense. I was well kept, I was well fed, and I really wanted for nothing, except my freedom. It all started one day when I visited a new therapist. Dr. McAllister had been recommended by a friend of mine. He said he was very good, and he'd helped him get through a lot of issues that he had with his mother and discover some things about his sexuality. He put you under and put you in touch with your real self, and that was how he overcame a lot of your issues. It all sounded great to me. I'd been having trouble sleeping and was looking for some way to get the sleep I needed to function. My insomnia would sometimes last for days, and it was starting to affect my life. So, I made an appointment, and 2 weeks later I was lying on his couch, listening to Dr. McAllister count down from 10 as he put me in a suggestive trance. It was very sudden, like blinking, but everything changed after that trance. When I came out just as suddenly, Dr. McAllister looked strange, and I asked if something had happened. Strange may not be descriptive enough. He looked somehow enraptured, enlightened, utterly worshipful. You spoke to me about things you couldn't possibly have known. You talked to me about my childhood. You helped me get over the death of my mother. You helped me more in this hour-long session than I've ever helped anyone. I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but when he gripped my hand, his eyes shone like the lights of a zealot. I need more. Please let me put you back under, so I can discover more. I pulled away from him and took a huge step back. What the hell was he talking about? I had come here for help, but suddenly he wanted me to help him. I had to get out of here. I had to leave now. McAllister tried to stop me, but I was out the door before he could say much more than stop. I didn't sleep well that night either. It was becoming a real problem. Sometimes I would lay in bed and swear I heard whispers, but I put it off as auditory hallucinations. I hadn't slept well in the past 3 weeks, and I knew it was something that would catch up to me eventually. When I would force myself out of the house for work or to run errands, I could swear I felt someone watching me. What's more, I could swear I'd catch glimpses of someone from the corner of my eye, but they would always be gone when I turned to look at them. It never happened in my house, always when I was out and about, and the paranoia on top of the sleep deprivation was slowly eroding my sanity. So, when I heard someone open a window in my living room one night, I rolled over and just thought it was me having paranoid hallucinations. Turned out, it hadn't been a hallucination. When I heard someone open my bedroom door, I rolled over and found Dr. McAllister standing there watching me. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well either, and his eyes looked crazed as we stood staring at each other. I wasn't sure if he was real or not, but when he lunged at me, I curled into a ball and cried out for him to stop. He didn't attack me, though. He didn't hurt me at all. Though now, I wish he'd killed me right there. Instead, he just slipped a needle into my arm, and I watched his thumb push down the plunger as I felt a wave of warm and inviting sleep roll through me. I woke up in a finished basement, the lights turned down low, strapped to a chair as Dr. McAllister made sure my bindings were comfortable. I struggled, my limbs heavy and uncoordinated, but he held up a fresh needle and told me if I didn't calm down, he was going to put me out again. I made myself as still as I could, not sure what to expect here. This didn't seem to be a sexual thing. I was fully dressed, and the way he was tending to me almost felt worshipful. I didn't want it to come to this, but I can't live without the knowledge you possess. I know you don't believe what I'm saying, but while you were unconscious, you told me about things that may very well change my life. You spoke to me of things that opened my eyes, ideas I had never even conceived of, and the longer I went without hearing your voice again, the more I felt my newfound security crumbling. I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this, but I had to possess you, to have your knowledge, to understand your words. I can promise you that while you remain with me, you'll want for nothing. You are to me as a captured god that I wish to understand. We talked a lot that night, though I mostly yelled at him to let me go. In the end, though, he just injected me with something to knock me out, and I drifted off into a peaceful unconsciousness. And that was how I became Dr. McAllister's captive god. I will say that while I was with him, I never wanted for restful sleep. This was due in part to the fact that I spent most of my time in a near catatonic state. Dr. McAllister kept me restrained in a large underground area that I always thought of as the basement. I was seated in a large, comfortable chair, my hands secured to the arms with soft straps. There was a remote at hand, and I was allowed to watch anything I wanted on television, as long as the doctor was away. If I was hungry, all I had to do was push a button, and a short blonde woman, who I would later discover was the doctor's wife, would bring me anything I wanted. In the beginning, it really wasn't so bad. I was kept in a sluggish state from the drugs he used on me to induce the state that he wanted, but it wasn't bad. I watched TV, I ate, I existed. Given that I had worked 40-plus hours a week and lived off crappy food for most of my adult life, I felt almost like I was being pampered. I was free to relax. I could do almost anything, except leave or talk to people who were likely to wonder what had happened to me. My mom, my dad, my friends. I wondered if any of them wondered what had happened to me. It may seem odd to you that I never tried to escape, but my head was always in a cloud of some sort. The drugs left me just lucid enough to consume TV or audiobooks, but I never felt able to really settle my thoughts on anything in particular. I knew I should want to escape, but it was always a hard concept to catch hold of. Those days were the good days, back when Dr. McAllister was still operating his practice. That was when he was still pretending to have a normal life. He would come down in the evenings to talk with me, just telling me his problems and asking me to help. He would ask me about stocks or bonds, the housing market, business ideas, patents, inventions, and I would try my best to direct him in the way he wanted. I wasn't really sure what he wanted. My head was too foggy most of the time to make sense of it, but I would try my best to help him without the need to be placed in an unconscious state. We'd talk for hours about everything from the state of his marriage, the depraved childhood he had lived through, the future of psychology, and even the condition of his soul. I didn't always want to hear what he had to say, but I understood that it didn't really matter what I wanted. It didn't seem to make much of a difference anyway. We would talk for hours, but the end result was always a needle in my arm or my neck and several hours of blissful unconsciousness. I remember little from these periods of blackout, fortunately, but sometimes I would go to a dark place and just hang suspended in the murk. Things would whisper to me there, tell me things I couldn't understand. I was powerless to stop them. This happened very rarely, but it was still too often for my tastes. I don't know what I said to Dr. McAllister in those times, but there was always a drastic change when I came back to myself. It wasn't always for the better either. Once I came back to myself and felt something wet in my lap. I glanced down, which was difficult because my head was strapped to the headrest, and found that someone had thrown a head into my lap. I flinched away from it as my groggy brain finally clicked it all together, but it was little more than a shudder in my current state. The head had wispy gray hair, a pair of broken glasses hanging across the face from one ear, and a nose full of broken veins from a lifetime of drinking. I didn't recognize it, but as it soaked the pants of my pajamas, I did feel like it was familiar somehow. Dr. McAllister was sitting across from me, looking expectantly at the gift he had literally dropped in my lap, and I looked at it with confusion as I asked why he had done this. You told me to. You said if I meant to truly get over the cruelty and abuse that my father had given me, then I had to destroy the icon of my father within myself. So I did. I told him that I wanted to meet so we could discuss our past and reconcile. He was ecstatic. He hadn't seen me in 20 years, and oh, did we reconcile. I waited for him to turn around, and I bashed his head in with a hammer, choking him to death as he lay twitching on the floor. Then I took the body and disposed of it, cutting the head off so I could show you that I'd followed your instructions. You're so wise, so correct. I am your loyal disciple, always. I started screaming, mindless, gibbering noise, but he just bowed to me, and when the head hit the ground next to him, he didn't even flinch. That was my first inclination that the things I was saying in my sleep might be used in this way, in ways that I had never considered. After that, he started bringing people down to see me. At first, it was his wife, the blonde woman who'd been feeding me. She looked skeptical as she approached, content to keep her husband's secrets, but unsure of joining him in this new experiment. I knew from our talks that he was afraid she would leave him, but enjoyed the financial stability of their marriage. He stuck me with the needle as she sat a few feet away, and when I came to, she was bowing and crying and thanking me for helping her see the truth. My husband was right. You are truly a god. I was wrong to ever doubt you, or him. After that, it was friends and colleagues. They all seemed confused when he introduced them to me, calling me his god of knowledge, and some of them laughed, thinking it was a joke. They would sit and talk to me, listening to my answers and looking at McAllister as if to ask if this were an elaborate prank. In the end, though, when I came back from the little nap he would subject me to, it was always the same. Their smirks of disbelief or scowls of confusion were replaced with rapturous awe, and they would pledge their undying fealty to me. No matter how many of them I begged to release me, the outcome was always the same. A religion of sorts began to form. Over time, McAllister drew in his cult. It was only a few at first, 5, 10, but it quickly grew into a sizable little flock. The followers began to take care of me, washing and feeding and seeing to my every whim, except the most important. I would ask them to release me, beg them to let me go, but it was always interpreted as a test of some sort. Their god was testing them to see if they were loyal to the here or to the hereafter, and they would thank me for helping them fortify their belief in me as they slid my hands back into the restraints or pushed my head back into the buckles. I yelled at them. I called them idiots. I tried to push them, but the constant use of sedatives and the lack of any regular exercise had made me weak. I wasn't wasting away, but I wasn't getting the exercise I needed to be certain. I could do little to free myself. My bonds always replaced, and after a while I just gave in. The funny thing was that whatever I was telling them while I was under, was working. McAllister showed me the money he had made, earned from the stock market and selling property, and the cult began to thrive. What's more, they all claimed to have cast off whatever addictions or mental health problems or childhood traumas had plagued them, and they were addicted now to nothing but serving me. Like McAllister had said, those who tried to leave or to return to their lives reported feeling hopeless and manic unless they could return to my presence and hear my words, whatever they were. That's when things started to get bad. McAllister was truly addicted to my influence, and it led him to overstep. McAllister had been gathering his followers at his home, and while it was large, it was becoming too small to hold all of them. I can't really speculate how many there were, but the basement was standing room only. I sat beneath a small bar that he was standing on, and the sea of bodies was dizzying. Though he was speaking, they all looked at me as if I were speaking through him. So many eyes looking at me. My body still held in the chair I had sat in for God knew how long. Was something I never quite got used to. It never made me feel like a deity. It never made me feel powerful to have them worship me. It always made me feel like a pet, my freedom just one open door away. McAllister said they'd be moving to a new place soon, a place that would house them all comfortably. They could all stay there indefinitely, leaving their jobs and lives behind so they could care for their captive god. He didn't say where it was, but he said they would all go this afternoon and prepare for a long journey. They were all so happy, their faces enraptured as he told them about their new home. But I began to feel that this would never end. When he began to bring people to see me, I had hoped that someone would fail to see me as he did and get me out of here. They would take me away from him. They would call the police, and I would be saved from my captivity. That never happened. Whatever power I had held them in sway, and after a while I doubted that I would ever get out of here. I didn't know how long I had been McAllister's captive god, but I knew that no matter how comfortable the life, this had to end. I decided then that if they weren't going to get me out, I would have to do it myself. Strangely, my chance came that very day. They had all left me so they could prepare, and as I sat in the shadowy basement, I realized that my wrist strap was undone. This had never happened before. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. It took all the energy I had to focus enough to get my hand to undo the other strap. And when I bent down to undo my legs, the effort seemed to take years. My mind was like unraveling yarn, and it was hard to focus on any particular task. When the bonds came off my legs, I got shakily to my feet before bending to rub some life into them. They were prickly from the lack of use, and I took shaky steps as I made for the stairs. I got to the top before I was discovered. I peeked through the door and into the barren kitchen beyond. The cupboards were empty, the countertops clean, and I could tell that this room had already been cleaned out for the move. I had just decided to take a step out and make for the back door when someone walked into the kitchen and saw me. They called for McAllister, walking to me as they insisted I return to my chair. I pushed at them, telling them to get away from me, to get out of my way, but as I lunged for the back door, I heard others coming in to stop me. I made it to the backyard, squinting at the sun as it hit my eyes, but I found it fenced with tall wooden boards. I was grabbed by many hands, and when someone slipped a needle into my neck, I looked back to see McAllister instruct them to get me in the car. I came to sometime later. and I was laying in an elaborate bed, my hands cuffed to the frame. That began the worst part of my confinement, though it was thankfully the end of it. After that, the drugging became worse. McAllister and his inner circle kept me in a near constant catatonic state. The drugs he used were no longer just injected, and they began to experiment with other substances. The documents that were found later said they received different outcomes when different kinds of drugs were used, and they often sat around and drank or laughed as I came in and out of reality. I was aware of nothing in those times. A ship drifting on a sea of time. I could have been with them for days. I could have spent decades under their control. But to me, time was only islands glimpsed from afar. I didn't see many people in that time, just the 5 or so who were in McAllister's inner circle. But these men always spoke as if they were doing very well. Often there was cigar smoke around my bed, the smell of expensive liquor, and always the low murmur of talk as they waited for me to tell them what else they might do to gain more power. I'd become their oracle, their captive god as opposed to their revered deity, and they threatened to use me up. These are the times I remember the least about, except for the end. I spent a lot of my days in a black stupor, and the more they experimented, the more often I was back in the dark place. When I came back from these trances, I noticed a change in my captors. Gone were the shining eyes of the enraptured. Disappeared were the weeping orbs of the enlightened. They were replaced by the flinty eyes of the zealot, and I was afraid that he might break his promise. He looked angry, but also resolved. Whatever I had told him weighed heavily on him, but I wouldn't understand the burden, not for a while yet. Not until the day it all came to an end. I came to one afternoon to find an intrusive light leaking into my dark chamber. They had always kept me in this persistent dark room, but now the door was open, and something was laying in it. On the floor, there were others, none of them moving, and I was confused by their sudden stillness. Was this something new? Were they sleeping, or were they... I tried to put that thought out of my head. They couldn't be dead, I reminded myself as I shook my chains. If they were all dead, then who would free me so I didn't die here too? I did as you said, came a monotone voice, and I jumped as I realized that one of the slumped forms had only been praying. It was McAllister. He looked wild. His salt and pepper hair was sticking up at odd angles, and his face was splattered with blood. His shirt was soaked in something as it hung on him like a wet sack. He appeared to be praying, but as something clinked in his shaky hands, I saw that he held a gun. I was afraid that he would shoot me too for half a second, but as he put it under his chin, I became even more afraid that he would use it on himself. I have risen as high as I can. Your will dictates that I must shed my vehicle to rise any higher. I shall see you on the other side. His blood made a crimson line across my face as the gun went off. And suddenly, my fears were realized. I was alone. Luckily for me, someone heard the gunshot. I would lay in that bed for 2 days before the FBI came to investigate the compound. Turned out they'd been keeping an eye on McAllister for quite some time, ever since he had started gathering followers at his home. After 2 years in his new compound, they had begun to try to prepare a case against him, before he woke up one morning and decided to put an end to his little flock. With the help of his wife, they had poisoned the morning meal, and McAllister had drawn his inner circle to a meeting before breakfast. That's where he shot them, as they sat listening to my latest ramblings. They had found journals that claimed there were things I had told them, but after interviewing me, I think they decided that he was out of his mind. At least, that's what Agent Maxit led me to believe. We're going to have to hold you as a person of interest, but it honestly sounds like you were an unwilling participant. I'm going to go and get some things in order. Have a seat. We'll make some accommodations for you. After he left, I noticed the recorder sitting on the table. It wasn't running, which I had expected, and when I reached for it, I saw the tape inside had a date on it that I remembered. It was the date of my first session with Dr. McAllister. Couldn't imagine a reason behind the FBI having a tape with that date on it, unless McAllister had recorded it for some reason. I put the recorder back down, trying to stop my curiosity before it could take root. I had never heard what I sounded like in that state that seemed to enrapture the old doctor so much. What had I said to him to make him throw his whole life away in the pursuit of it? I couldn't help myself. I hit play on the recorder and listened as McAllister told me to be calm and began to count down from 10. It wasn't the jagged, often flighty voice I remembered from any time after his session. This was McAllister at his most sane, and as he came to 1, I heard him gasp and ask what I was doing. From the recording, I heard a slightly deeper version of my own voice, and it filled me with dread. Agent Maxit has been listening to the tapes. He's becoming as unstable as the good doctor. If you don't escape now, I fear that he'll have you just like McAllister did. You'll have to be quick, and you'll have to be smart. But if you mean to be free, you need to find a way out of here. Good luck. It was a pretty normal thing to ask of a cat. Catch the rat and get your reward. I moved recently, and somehow I got a rat in my stuff. The apartment I had moved from was kind of a dump, but I'd never had a problem with rats. So when I opened the box and out came a big black wharf rat, I nearly had a heart attack. It came barreling out of the box and ran right behind my stove, all 3 of my cats watching it curiously from the top of the couch where they were perched. I remember glowering at them, little cowards, but being madder at Calvin more than the others. The other 2 were little more than kittens, half-grown and barely out of eating dry food soaked in gravy. Calvin, however, was a full-grown cat. I hadn't set out to have 3 cats in a 1-bedroom apartment, of course. It just kinda happened by mistake. Calvin had been a birthday present from my mom. He'd been a scrawny little orange kitten, and she had meant for him to keep me company in my new studio apartment. She had pulled him out of her pocket with a little flourish, and I had sighed as I tried to refuse him. He was very cute, his inquisitive amber eyes looking around with curiosity, but I really didn't want something to take care of right now. Keep him for the weekend. If you still don't want him, I'll come back and get him, she said. By Monday, you couldn't have taken him from me by any means less than high explosive. He was a playful little thing, always zooming around and getting into trouble, and I spent many nights with him curled up in my lap or sitting on my feet as I went to sleep. After a few months, though, he became kind of sluggish and mopey. I talked to a friend of mine, and she said he was probably lonely. She told me that cats are social creatures, and that it might perk him up if he had a little playmate. I talked to Mom, and she told me that the lady she'd gotten Calvin from had just had another litter of kittens. Calvin's brother cousin would probably be ready to leave his mom soon, and I could have a little friend for Calvin to play with. That's how Hobbs came to be my new addition. Before he could even arrive, though, I found Grayson. I was just walking through the Dollar General parking lot, just wanting to get a few things for dinner, when this pathetic little mew from under a giant truck caught my attention. He was a half-starved little gray kitten, scared and lost and looking for help. He was too small to even fight me when I picked him up and put him in my shirt pocket. I picked up a few things while I was inside, a water bowl and some wet food, and Grayson joined my growing little brood of cats. Calvin hated him at first, hissing and spitting at this interloper. But after a few weeks, I saw them playing and running together like old friends. Grayson seemed to idolize Calvin. And when I brought Hobbs home, the two of them hissed and spit at him until they finally accepted him as part of their world. The Littles, as I started calling them, followed Calvin around ceaselessly, and he was a good big brother and showed them how to be productively mischievous, as house cats often are. Then, when I got a raise at work, finally making the sort of money that could change my life, I moved out of my dingy studio apartment and into a nice 2-bedroom in a better part of town. And now, I had a rat. I spent the first 2 weeks in my new apartment ignoring him. I could hear him scuttling around, but I hoped he would leave on his own. I had 3 cats after all. Rats are supposed to leave if they smell a cat, right? This fellow didn't care about the existence of my timid little felines, though. He ate my snack cakes from the cupboard, tore into my breakfast cereal, and chewed holes in my bread and dry goods. After the 3rd morning of grabbing a cereal box and finding the contents spilling out onto the linoleum, I got angry. That's when I started trying to get rid of the damn rat. I put out traps, I put down glue boards, I bought poison and put it out in places that I knew would be hard for the cats to get to. I filled any hole I could find with steel wool and spray foam and hot pepper granules. When that failed to get the results, I hired an exterminator to come and have a look. To my surprise, he put down traps and bait and said he'd be back in a week. I rolled my eyes after he left, thinking that I had already done all of that. When that failed to get any result too, I started getting desperate. I bought those little noise generator things that are supposed to drive rats crazy. I bought candles that are supposed to make them go nuts. I used essential oils and left out different smelly foods that are supposed to drive them away. Nothing made any progress though. That's when I really started to get angry at my cats. I shouldn't have taken out my frustration on them, but I was becoming ridiculous. There's 3 of you. How is it that you can't catch one freaking rat? He's been eating your cat food too, you know, chewing holes straight into the bag. Are you really going to let him get away with that? The 3 of them just stared at me blankly, not understanding a damn thing I said. Okay, how about this? The first one of you who gets that rat gets a can of wet food. The good stuff too. The $3 a can stuff. That seemed to perk them up. Once the cats were out of kittenhood, I had weaned all of them off of wet food. I hadn't given them wet food in nearly 6 months, and they had spent the last 3 months mewing and looking at me expectantly anytime I opened a can of soup or ravioli. Cats aren't stupid. I had always suspected as much, and the way the 2 smaller ones looked at each other left little doubt that they were plotting something. Grayson and Hobbs were younger than Calvin, and they often worked together to manage mischief pretty well. Calvin, on the other hand, looked thoughtfully and stared off at the kitchen. Later that night, as I curled up in bed, I noticed that Calvin was missing from my usual cuddle pile. Grayson was sprawled across my chest, Hobbs laying on my pillow as his fluffy body lay across the top of my head, but Calvin's comfortable weight was absent from my legs. Calvin had slept across my legs every night since he'd come to stay with me, and it was strange now to be thinking about sleep without him there. I called him, patting the bed and pss-pss-pssing at him, but he refused to come to bed. Finally, I just rolled over and went to sleep. He'd turn up. When he finally turned up, it was to show me the dead wharf rat dangling from his teeth. I woke up slowly as the big yellow cat put his paws on my chest. I opened my eyes and saw the dead rat hanging inches from my face. I struggled awake, startled back to consciousness, as the cat proudly held the rat by the tail and dangled it in front of me. The other 2 came sniffing around, looking reverently at Calvin and his prize, but he hissed and spit as he scared them back. This was his prize alone. He followed me into the kitchen, the rat still swinging as I looked through the cabinets for any wet food we might have left over. I found a can of Old Fancy Feast, something I had picked up for a special occasion, and when it went plop into the bowl, he dropped the rat and began to eat. As he dipped his head to eat, I got my first look at the rat. It was unbloodied, its fur unruffled from a fight, and the way its body had curled made me think that Calvin had jumped on him and broken his back. I swept him into a dustpan and dumped him out onto the fire escape, leaving him out there for the scavengers to pick apart. I heard Calvin hiss at the littles as they came close, scattering them before he went back to eating. I reflected that it might have been a mistake to introduce Calvin to wet food again. Calvin had, after all, been the hardest to break. He had never really had it before the kittens came into the house, to my knowledge. He'd been big enough for dry food when Mom brought him to me, Until Grayson had come, he had never had a taste. Grayson had been small, much smaller than Calvin, and I had quickly learned that they could not eat anywhere near each other. Calvin would take Grayson's food without hesitation, snarfing up all the wet food as quickly as possible. It didn't seem to matter if it made him sick or not. He would fill his belly with as much wet food as he could get, and then flop down in a contented ball. It got to the point where I had to feed Grayson in my bedroom, the poor little kitten wasting away as his food was stolen again and again. I did the same with Hobbs, but Calvin still seemed to find a way to take their food sometimes. Calvin was sneaky, and when his amber eyes found something they wanted, he tended to get it. I should have known when he flopped over, his belly full, that this wouldn't be the last. The next night, as I was getting ready for bed, I walked into my room and yelped in horror as I nearly tripped over a second dead rat. This one was a little smaller, a little more normal rat-sized than the wharf rat Calvin had brought me the night before. As I inspected it, he crept silently up and butted my leg. He looked pleased with himself, looking at me expectantly as he waited for his prize. I tried to be supportive of his latest kill, admonishing him as I put out what little wet food I still had. I made a mental note to get more tomorrow. He watched me smugly as I came home with 2 more cans, hoping I wouldn't need them. He took that night off, but the next night, 2 small mice were in front of my bedroom door. This was becoming ridiculous. How was my apartment this infested? I hadn't seen so much as a roach or a mouse turd anywhere other than from the big rat that Calvin had killed. Not in the cabinets, not behind the fridge, not anywhere. Suddenly, Calvin was turning up with 4 to 5 times the number of rodents I had thought I had, and that was a problem. I made a note to call an exterminator the next day and disposed of the carcasses. I gave him the wet food and went to bed, figuring I would have a long day tomorrow. I called the exterminator on my lunch break, and he agreed to come out that afternoon. He met me at the door to my apartment, wearing an orange jumpsuit and carrying a heavy can of poison. He introduced himself as Mark. He asked me what I had going on, and I told him that my cats had been catching a lot of vermin since I moved in. He said that was pretty common, especially this close to the canal, and he said he'd have a look. The littles immediately came over to rub up against him, but I noticed that Calvin was keeping his distance. He looked at the exterminator distrustfully, keeping his perch atop the bookcase as his tail flicked unhappily. Mark set to work immediately, checking under the counters and shining his UV light around as he tried to find the rat's sign. He went through the kitchen, the bathroom, my bedroom, and finally checked the living room before making his way into my office. He said he hadn't found any rat sign, other than a small amount of scat under the sink. He said it looked like a single rat might have been here briefly, but that would explain the stowaway I found in my belongings. But what about the other 3, I asked. Mark shrugged. No clue. I'll come back in a week and check the glue traps, but I don't think I'll find anything. I told him I'd call him if anything changed, and he left after a few more pets from the littles and a few more glowers from Calvin. That night, Calvin came up with another rat. I praised him again, but I was beginning to wonder where he was coming up with all these rats. By the end of the week, it was really starting to get out of hand. Calvin had brought me a total of 10 rats throughout the week, as well as 2 roaches and a grasshopper. He had eaten wet food every night that week, and the littles were clearly starting to feel some sort of way about it. They woofed down their dry food, but I could see a lot of hooded glances towards Calvin as he dined on canned food. I was tempted to give them all wet food, but that would only make it harder to break the cycle once the rats stopped appearing. No, eventually Calvin would stop finding rats and bringing them to me, and the whole thing would just go away. Then, Hobbs decided to change the game. After feeding everyone and making sure their water bowls were full one night, I was heading to bed when I stopped in front of the door and looked for Calvin's latest offering. Calvin had been leaving me offerings there since the first night he had brought me the giant rat, and tonight was the first night in a while that I hadn't almost stepped on a dead mouse or a rat on the way to bed. I looked around, thinking he had left it near the door, but there was nothing. Calvin came up then, looking proud of himself, but seemed confused when he couldn't find anything. That's when Hobbs strolled up with a dead mouse swinging from his teeth. Hobbs laid the mouse at my feet, and I bent to congratulate him on his kill. He accepted my pets, eyes straying to Calvin, and I could swear that Calvin stared hatefully at him. It's hard to tell with cats sometimes. Their faces can be a little inexpressive if you're not used to them. Still, I saw Calvin crinkle his eyes and glower at Hobbs, the same way he had glowered at the exterminator. He sat on his bookcase and stared daggers at the little kitten as he ate his wet food. I looked at the two of them, wondering if I should leave them alone out here. I shrugged it off, though. They had never tried to hurt each other before, aside from some playful wrestling, and when Grayson followed me to bed, I tipped the door a little so they could come to bed when they were finished. The next morning, though, there was no sign of Hobbs. There was no sign of a struggle either. Everything was as I had left it the night before. The door was locked, the floors were clean, nothing was amiss at all. It was as if Hobbs had simply vanished. I asked around the apartment complex, hoping maybe he had gotten out, but no one had seen hide nor tail of the little guy. I came home feeling very upset, and Grayson and Calvin tried their best to comfort me. I went to bed with Grayson curled up on my chest, missing the fluffy weight of Hobbs at my head. Calvin, however, stayed out in the living room. He seemed forever on the hunt these days. A week went by, and I still found myself filling Hobbs's bowl and calling for him at bedtime. Grayson was becoming standoffish towards Calvin. I usually came home to find them apart, staring at each other apprehensively. Calvin, on the other hand, pranced around like the lord of the house. There was at least one mouse or rat by the door of my room every night at bedtime, and Calvin was becoming larger than I thought a cat his size should be. He had been the size of a normal house cat a month ago, but now he was approaching the size of a small wild cat. I had chalked it up to all the wet food, but then the other rodents started showing up. On Monday, Calvin brought me a white rat. Calvin had started bringing them to me himself, lest we have another Hobbs incident where someone else took credit for his handiwork. When he set it down, I remembered thinking that it seemed oddly filled out for a wild rat. The rat had been taken care of and looked as though it had been fed regularly. I gave Calvin a hard look, but he only looked at me mildly with those amber eyes as if to say, "It's a rat, wet food now." I sighed and opened him a can, Grayson following closely at my heels as we went to bed. On Tuesday, Calvin brought me a squirrel. It was clearly a squirrel, though the tail had been chewed off. It wasn't a baby squirrel either, or some half-starved yearling. This was a full-grown squirrel that my cat was trying to pass off as a rat. I gave him the food, but I told him not to lure squirrels into the house anymore. He pretended to listen, relishing his wet food as he ate. On Wednesday, Calvin brought me a hamster. There was no disguising this one. He was red and white, his little cheeks stuffed with seeds, and by this point, I was making excuses. Maybe it had crawled in from the vents. Maybe someone's pet had gotten loose and wandered into the apartment. There was no way Calvin could get out of the apartment, right? On Thursday, Calvin brought me a guinea pig. He didn't even try to hide his smugness this time. Calvin flopped the fat little sausage of a rodent down and looked up at me expectantly. His eyes, had they always been that color? I remember them being more amber than crimson. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Perhaps I was just seeing things. My hands shook as I opened the can, and I closed the door this time as I went to bed. Calvin had grown another 3 inches seemingly overnight, and I was having a harder and harder time discerning his growth patterns without apprehension. Then, on Friday, I came home from work to find my landlord out in the hallway. I just thought I'd ask if maybe you'd seen my chinchilla. I told him I didn't know what a chinchilla looked like, to be honest, and he sighed. "It's my daughter's. It's missing. I paid over $1,000 for that little monster, and now he's just suddenly disappeared. If you see him, please let me know." I was waiting for Calvin that night when he came trotting in, the chinchilla holed snugly between his teeth. That's when I lost my temper with him. I told him this was unacceptable. He couldn't just go around killing people's pets. He had probably been catching other pets and killing them as well, and I was tired of it. I grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, and Calvin yowled miserably as I dragged him to the pet carrier. I put him in and locked the door, the spring locks keeping it shut. He could spend the night in the carrier to think about what he had done. He yowled and morowled as Grayson and I went to bed. I heard him kicking around in there as I tried to sleep. After a little while, though, he quieted, and I finally went to bed. I woke up to an empty bed, though. I looked around for Grayson, expecting to have him curled up next to me, and finding nothing. Again, there was no sign of a struggle, no blood or evidence of foul play, just a lack of cat and a sense of absence. I left the room, my eyes inevitably straying to the cat carrier in the corner as I searched the house for Grayson. Calvin and Hobbs had been like children to me, but Grayson had been special, even amongst my cats. I felt like I had saved him, like I had kept him from dying, and now he was gone. I had to halt my search to stop myself from sobbing more than once. After I'd checked every room in the house, every hiding place, every nook and cranny, I turned my attention back to the pet carrier. It had been silent the whole time, unmoving and seemingly empty. I moved in slowly, not sure what to expect. Was Calvin dead too? He had spent a lot of time last night yowling, and now he was as silent as the grave. I bent low, putting my face near the mesh and looking in to find nothing. The pet carrier was empty. I jumped when someone knocked on my door, their thumping sounding frantic. It was the landlord again, and he looked very pale. "Excuse me, I'm going door to door. Have you seen, I mean," he lost what little composure he had, and I felt his face press against my shoulder, his tears moistening my shirt. "My son's missing. Have you seen anyone who might have taken him? I put him to bed in his crib last night, and when I woke up this morning, he was just gone. His mother's nearly catatonic, and the police can't find any evidence of a break-in. I don't know what to do. I'm seeing if anyone has seen anything. It's all I know to do." I commiserated with him, telling him that I would let him know if I saw anything. But my guts were already a-roil with fear. Surely he hadn't. There was no way. He was there on the coffee table as I closed the door, tail flicking in agitation. There was something in his mouth, something thick and pink, and as he rose up and sauntered over to me, I backed away, not wanting to see what it was. He was leaving little red splotches on the floor in his wake as he carried the strange offering to me, and I was even more certain that I didn't want it anywhere near me. However, when my bottom came up hard against the door, I was out of room to retreat. He lay the offering at my feet, looking up coldly with none of his usual smugness, and staying put to watch as I pushed it over with the toe of my shoe. Even without the toes, I could tell it was a small, delicate foot that someone had unceremoniously detached from the owner. The foot of an infant, if I had to guess. He's out there now, eating his wet food as I lay in bed with the doors locked. I flushed the remains of the small foot down the toilet. It flushed surprisingly easy, but I saw Calvin watching me the whole time from the door. All he does now is watch me, and I'm frankly afraid to touch him. He's different, not really like a cat anymore, and when he tried to jump in my lap earlier, I pushed him away. I just can't stand to have him near me. However, I'll be giving him his wet food from now on, rat or no rat. I'm afraid of what might happen if I let him get too hungry. I envy these kids nowadays. That probably makes me sound like an old fart, but they really do have a lot more options than we did when we were their age. My youngest is neurodivergent, while my oldest has ADHD, which is bad enough to sometimes give him terrible anxiety. We have any number of things around the house to help with said anxiety. Poppets, fidget spinners, fidget cubes, sensory blankets, you name it, and we probably have it somewhere. My youngest son picked them up early, and they seemed to help him cope with the stress that his autism often brought on. My oldest scoffed at the gadgets my son had, but he left them lying around, and my oldest started playing with them too. Now he doesn't go anywhere without his fidget cube, and his hands seem glued to it around test time. All I had when I was his age was a worry stone, and I probably worried away more than a quarry of them. So when my youngest left his Karmagami on the living room floor one afternoon, my first exposure to it wasn't exactly positive. If you're unaware of what those are, they're these little revolving toys that have different patterns on each of the faces. As you rotate it, the picture changes, and the transitioning images are supposed to be soothing. That, however, was not my initial reaction to them. He had left it in the living room floor beside the couch, right in a blind spot. So as I came around the corner one day, wanting to get a little lunch from the kitchen, I stepped down on the pokey end of the toy. After a few minutes of cursing and hopping around, I was ashamed to see that I had broken my son's new favorite sensory toy. I looked at the time and realized I only had about an hour to find a new one before he came home and had a fit. Quick trip to Walmart and $10 bought me an exact copy, but before I could leave, one of them caught my eye. It was a galaxy scene, the stars and nebulas giving me a strange, serene feeling. I decided to buy one for myself, feeling a little silly for wanting a kid's toy, but getting over it pretty quickly. As I sat at my desk and flipped through the scenes of open space, I felt a serenity I hadn't known since I was very young. I have a certain amount of anxiety myself, and the weird rotating thing soothed me when it all became too much. My wife rolled her eyes at me a little, but I noticed she wasn't in any hurry to get rid of her fidget cube either. So it sat on my desk, and there it was well used and well loved. At least, until recently. I've been working on a book for the last couple of years, and it was finally beginning to come together. It was polished. The test readers I'd let have a look at it said they couldn't wait for the next chapter, and I was excited to get the final draft to my editor after so long. As I edited it, the little toy became the object most often at hand. I would turn it over and over without thinking about it, the galaxy spinning as my tale spun itself closer and closer to completion. I was turning it as I worked my way through the last fourth of the book, when something besides the swirl of the heavens caught my eye. I looked down, seeing the corner of the starry sky, and then I saw something on the face that was not the Galileo space probe or a black hole. It was eyes. I dropped the thing in surprise, but I had definitely seen a pair of bloodshot eyes. I could swear the veins had pulsed a little, the pupils staring at me, and I had been so startled by the intrusion that I picked my feet up into my chair like I thought it might bite me. I reached down after a few seconds of sitting like that, feeling silly, and when I picked it back up, I could see the familiar black hole and space probe among the bed of stars. I shook it off, thinking I'd just been working too hard. Started flipping the little toy in my hand again. As the words began to fall comfortably into place, I forgot about the eyes. I put it off as an optical illusion. It kept spinning and spinning, stopping only to make edits or change something here and there, and I didn't think about it again until later that night. I was talking with my editor on the phone, telling her about my progress and playing with the Karmagami, when it happened again. I figured I've got about 10 more chapters before I'm done with the third draft. I think then I might be ready to pass it to the proofreader so we can make it ready for publication. The absent-minded flipping was cathartic, my hands busy as my mind whirled over the things I still needed to do. I had to finish the second draft, get the cover art finished, get the final page count, and as I thought about it, my fingers flicked the little toy around and around. The spacescape spun faster and faster, the stars practically winking as I talked to Edith about the upcoming book. I'd forgotten about the eyes, chalking it up to stress, and the little thing hadn't been far from my hand since. "That's great, kid. If they're anything like the last pages you sent me, I can't wait to see them. Did you fix the problem you've been having with the third part?" "Yeah, I think so. I changed it so Mark and Ted move away while he kills Taylor. But the little toy had nearly slipped through my sweaty fingers, and I looked down to see the eyes staring up at me again. They were boring into me, judging me as they glared daggers into my Notre Dame t-shirt. As I watched the eyes, something emerged from the lower lip of the device, and I yelped as something bit me. I dropped the Karmagami and the phone I was talking on, looking down at my bleeding thumb as I shuddered on the couch. My wife and youngest son looked over at me, not sure what had happened, and I heard Edith from the floor asking what was going on. I reached for the phone, but my hands were shaking as the bite on my thumb bled. I apologized for the surprise, but the rest of my answer was a little less excited. When I felt my thumb throb, I looked down to find that the thing was back in my hand. I wanted to drop it, but I just couldn't make my hand release it. The space scene was back again. The eyes and teeth were gone, but my hands shook a little as I flipped through the pictures. I spoke absent-mindedly to Edith, but my eyes kept flicking down to the little puzzle toy. I expected to see the eyes again, but when the call ended, I let the phone slide down to the cushions and took the Karmagami in both hands again. "Boy," my wife said, "you sure are interested in that thing tonight." I nodded, but I felt a little cold as I kept flipping. My fingers felt crampy as I spun the image, unable to stop myself, and it no longer brought me the peace of mind that it once had. This was more like the feeling I used the device to forget, and the longer I held it, the more it made the emotions in me circle like a tornado. I had eyes only for the changing colors and patterns, and as they scrolled, I saw the depths of space open up, and the eyes returned to judge me. They swirled like galaxies all their own, the white orbs climbing up out of the depths of the void. The veins pulsed in the pale pools, beating to the tune of their own phantom heartbeat. I wanted to stop, but I was powerless as I saw that Cheshire Cat's smile oozing up as well. The teeth grinned wetly, drawing up at the corners as they ogled me. The teeth groaned like trees in a high wind, the mouth becoming a rictus as it continued to grow. The closer it came, the faster my hands moved. My fingers cramped, but they still worked as a blurry mechanism. Faster and faster, closer and closer, the eyes and mouth rising from the void as my movements seemed to summon them into the world. I couldn't tell if I was leaning in closer or they were getting bigger, but the longer I turned it, the more it encompassed my whole existence. When someone suddenly covered the object in my hand, taking it away from me in one smooth motion, I was both relieved and infuriated. I was in bed, completely unsure of how I'd gotten there, with my wife looking down on me with concern. "I think you've played with your toy enough for one night," she said, taking it over to my desk and setting it down. I smiled at her, a single tear sliding down my face, but inside, I wanted to jump up and throttle her. For the first time in my life, I wanted to hit her. I wanted to slam her head against the desk until she stopped moving, and then I wanted to pick up that toy and start moving the pieces again. I railed against the feelings, but they kept surging forward like eels just below the surface. She must have seen something when she looked back, because she paused before coming back to bed. Her look was strange, almost fearful, but she settled as I adjusted my face into something more normal. "What's gotten into you lately?" she asked, coming to bed as I pulled myself back to reality. "Just working too much lately," I stuttered, getting up as I got into my pajamas. Even as I got ready, I couldn't help but glance at the Karmagami. It was just sitting there, calling to me, begging to be touched, but I turned away as I went to lay next to my wife. The urge to hurt her had passed, and as we settled into bed, I felt like my old self again. I just needed a little distance from my favorite worry stone, and as I drifted off, I made a mental note to just let it sit there tomorrow. I closed my eyes and opened them in a dream void. I was floating naked in space, a long umbilicus sprouting from my navel. I was drifting, moving towards the last thing I expected to find out there. It got bigger the closer I floated, and I expected that it would suddenly burst open and reveal a bright flash of light. Maybe this was where the eyes came drifting from, though I'd certainly never seen it on the stickered background of my fidget toy. The door was massive, roughly 20 feet tall, and it only got bigger the closer I got. As it loomed up before me, I suddenly found myself not wanting to sit in that shadow. I didn't understand how it still had a shadow. Did things have shadows in space? I didn't know, but I didn't want to come anywhere near this thing. As little say as I seemed to have in the matter. It opened suddenly, as I had expected, bathing my eyes in star-dazzling light. As I shaded my eyes to see what was coming through, I saw those glittering teeth as they opened wide and came down loudly around me. I came awake with a deep gasp, finding only my sleeping wife and the dark room. It was still on the desk then, that hateful pyramid, but I don't believe it stayed there long. When I woke up the next morning, my fingers ached, and I was already spinning the galaxies in my hand. My arms were shaking from exertion, the eyes and mouth already growing as they threatened to break the bonds of the Karmagami. I threw it away before I could think better of it, and when it burst against the wall, my wife snorted before falling back asleep. I just sat there for a moment, hands extended, not sure where I'd found the nerve. It was the last thing I had wanted to do, but now that it was star-strewn pieces on the ground, I felt more at peace than I had in days. It couldn't haunt me anymore, couldn't make my fingers cramp, my head ache, but even as I slid back under the covers, I could feel my fingers wanting to work the puzzle yet again. When I woke up and found it sitting on the desk, right where my wife had left it, I almost cried. Over the next few days, the little thing was my obsession, despite my better judgment. If I was awake, the little puzzle was spinning, spinning, spinning in my hands. My pages were forgotten, my family ignored. I couldn't help it. My mind was consumed by nothing so much as freeing whatever was trapped inside this thing, even though I was truly terrified of it. I would come to the precipice, the eyes ready to pop free of the canvas which held them, only to drop it before the snapping teeth could bite me. I would resist its pull for a few minutes, an hour at the most, but then I'd come to and find it in my hand yet again. My wife stopped nagging me about it after the second day, just sighing disgustedly anytime she saw me fiddling with it. At some point, she left to take the kids to school, and they didn't come back. I was aware of them the same way I was aware that every 8 hours I needed to eat, but I don't think it truly registered as something to be worried about. The phone was ignored, sometimes my body functions as well, and before long I was simply sitting on the living room floor in my own filth, my fingers rustling the drapes a little, as they worked the picture at an eye-watering pace. I'm in one of my little breaks now, the device thrown against the wall as I try to resist the urge to use it. I took the time to get this down, hoping it would find someone, anyone, who might be having a similar problem. Sometimes the things that bring us joy are also the thing that destroys us. I don't know what sort of otherworldly being resides in this hunk of plastic and adhesive pictures, but it gets closer and closer to being born every time I pick the Karmagami up. For your own sake, if you ever see the eyes, don't fall into the same trap that has me. If you see the eyes, throw it away and forget it by any means possible. She was the perfect woman. I have no idea how I managed to catch her attention. Our relationship, our marriage, it was all perfect, except for one thing that neither of us could have foreseen. We met in college. She was working towards her English degree, and I was studying business. My major required me to take an English course, as did hers, and when she asked if the desk next to mine was taken, I was almost too stunned to answer. Kathy was beautiful in that artless way that some women have, and she smiled as I fumbled over my answer. That would have been the end of it for most people. I had fumbled my one chance. But Kathy wasn't like other women. She told me later that she had found it endearing, and she suspected that she was already a little bit taken with me when she sat down. When I saw you from across the room, I just knew that I wanted to get to know you better. We talked a little bit before class, comparing schedules and going over the usual getting-to-know-you chit-chat. When the teacher arrived and class began, I found myself snatching little glances at her as she bent over her notebook. She caught me looking once, and to my surprise, I saw her smile at me. I was smitten after that smile, and when Kathy invited me to have lunch with her after class, I didn't even have to think about it. We were dating a week later, and as we got closer, should have noticed the warning signs of problems to come. I suppose I understand how it escaped my notice, though. Few people would have considered utter peace and pure relaxation a problem. When we walked hand in hand, I would get this feeling of utter peace throughout my body. When we kissed, I felt like nothing in the world could hurt me. She made me feel safe, made my problems melt away, and I knew I wanted more than the few hours a day we got to share with each other. Her college schedule made it difficult to go out more than twice a week, and my own class load kept me busy too. Part of the reason we had such little time together, though, was Kathy's commute to and from school. Kathy lived an hour and a half from campus, and couldn't begin to afford an apartment on her meager student income. The job I worked, plus the leftover grant money I had, paid the rent on my studio apartment, but not much else. Another person paying rent was nice, but I couldn't say that was the only reason that I offered to let her live with me. I also wanted her close to me. She made me feel good, made me feel safe. Being in her presence made the dark world in which I lived more tolerable, and I wanted that for more than a few hours a week. I offered to let her move in, and after a week of mulling it over, she agreed. That weekend, we combined our meager possessions, and I slept like a baby in her arms that night. As we began to spend our evenings together, the problems became more apparent. Problems is a terrible word for it, because in the beginning, it was more like a godsend. When we sat on the couch, our hands linked, I would find myself getting drowsy. When we would cuddle on the couch, our bodies pressed together, I would lose minutes at a time, and my eyes would grow heavier and heavier. The feeling of peace I found in her presence put me at ease, and that ease led to some of the best sleep of my life. I would sleep more deeply than I ever had before, and wake up after 8 hours refreshed and ready to start my day. Kathy seemed pleased with the attention. She'd only been with one other person before we started dating, but I could tell that she wondered why I hadn't slept with her yet. Some women's feelings would have been hurt by this, but Kathy had been raised in a very religious household, and must have assumed that I was simply waiting till marriage. The truth was that, while I would have loved to have slept with her, the sleeping was the problem. Whenever we got close, my arms around her and our bodies pressed together, I would find myself blinking and suddenly losing long periods of time. Sometimes she would lead me to bed, sometimes she would just sleep with me on the couch, but I would always wake up next to Kathy with a deep feeling of fulfillment. I had assumed that she was feeling the same way. I often thought that maybe this was the feeling that we gave each other, and it made me feel good to bring her the same sort of peace that she brought me. This went on for about 6 months, and I thought that things were going well. We went out to dinner, we had friends over, we went on dates, and seemed to be living together with few problems. I had been tentatively looking at rings, preparing to pop the question and make it official. Besides the matter of intercourse, I thought we were happy. Then one evening I came home from class to find her crying on the couch. I hadn't seen her that day. She'd been absent from the one class we had together, and when I'd called her, she said she was feeling sick. It was nothing serious. She maybe had a cold or something. I'd told her to feel better, hanging up so that I could get to my next class. But as I saw her looking up from her cupped hands, I knew something was definitely wrong. I had never seen her cry before, and it was so alarming that I could do little else but go to her and wrap my arms around her. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong, but I wish now that I had pressed her. I wrapped her in my reassuring arms and tried my best to comfort her in her time of need. My reassuring arms quickly turned into drawing her close and wiping her tears away. This soon led to kissing, which led to touching, and then to the bedroom. I won't bore you with the details, but I think you know how it ended up. I woke up the next day, her hands lightly stroking my hair, and fresh tears running down her cheeks. It was our first time, and I couldn't even remember how it had gone. When I asked her to marry me a month later, she seemed overjoyed. We had been living together for half a year now, and our love for one another was pretty clear. She wore my engagement ring with pride, showing it off to her friends, and we began to plan our wedding. I was too blind to see that she was making appointments with a campus therapist more often than she used to. I was too comfortable to notice the tears that sometimes came to her while we lay in bed together. I was too wrapped up in my own feelings to notice the prescriptions that appeared in the medicine cabinet. I was just so comfortable that I never wanted it to end. It's easy to get tunnel vision when you're spending all your time in the tunnel of love, I suppose. After that first time, however, I did make efforts to be better in the bedroom. Kathy was patient with me, seeing that I was trying, but I often found myself trying one moment and waking up the next. She was always quick to reassure me that it was nothing to be ashamed about, but I knew it hurt her deeply to have a partner incapable of being intimate with her. So, I set out to find the reason for my sleeping fits. And so, I began to make doctor's appointments of my own. I said that the appointments were for her benefit, but I was honestly more concerned that I might have a real problem brewing. The last thing I wanted to discover at 22 was that I was a narcoleptic or had a problem with my brain or something. I explained what was happening to my doctor, and he was helpful, if not a little over-jovial. Kids your age shouldn't be having any sort of problems in that department, but we'll get you checked out, he assured me, with a smile and a pat on the shoulder. I was tested for every sleep disorder imaginable. I was given prescriptions of my own, but none of them seemed to work. I took supplements, signed up for new drugs that had just hit the market, and joined medical test groups. Despite all this, though, no one seemed to have any answer for what was going on. I was just so comfortable with my fiancée that I couldn't help but fall asleep in her arms. It would have been sweet if it wasn't worrying me to no end. We had decided on March for our wedding, the first anniversary of our meeting, and I was determined to make it special for her. I was as helpful and dutiful as a boyfriend/fiancé could be. I went with her to every stage of the planning. I picked out cake toppers, helped with seating charts, picked out menus, visited and put down a deposit on the venue, and comforted my soon-to-be wife every step of the way. The saving grace, of course, was that I could put my performance issues down as pre-wedding jitters as the day crept closer and closer. The wedding was easily the happiest day of my life. I stood at the altar, sweating in my rented tux, waiting for the moment she would arrive. The crowd huddled behind me in a murmuring throng of excited tension, and it felt like 1,000 years had passed before the music began from the organist. When I saw her in her dress, gliding down the aisle like a dream, I fell in love all over again. She was beautiful, her tears now ones of joy, and I never regretted asking her to join her life to mine. We exchanged rings, spoke vows of eternal love, and then walked from the church as husband and wife. As we stood for pictures, the venue having set up on the lawn to host our reception, I made ready to fulfill my end of tonight. I drank champagne for toasts and black coffee by the cup. I took caffeine supplements before we climbed into the car and left for our honeymoon suite. As she went into the bathroom to take her dress off, I walked around and tried my best to keep my heart racing. I told myself over and over again that tonight would be different, that tonight would repay for all the rest. I wanted nothing but to make her feel special and to make tonight one to remember. When she came out of the bathroom, the two of us standing before each other as husband and wife, I felt like I was possessed with all the energy and serenity I would ever need. When we woke up the next morning, intertwined as we always were, there were no tears on her cheek. Only a look of fulfillment I knew all too well. We settled into married life easily, and it was as though nothing had changed. Despite my best efforts, however, I couldn't recapture the magic of that night. Whenever I was in her arms, whenever we were close, I couldn't help but fall into that feeling of utter serenity and slip off to sleep. It was as if those feelings had multiplied after the wedding. She made me feel like I could die of happiness. I couldn't hold her hand as we drove anymore, lest I find myself listing off the road. If I cuddled on the couch with her to watch a movie, I would inevitably miss over half of it. I loved nothing more than to bask in that feeling of serenity that seemed to waft around her, but I also felt guilty as she seemed to return to her silent, tearful nature. I couldn't help myself. I was powerless to resist the pull of her, and I was powerless to do anything when I was in her arms. I began to notice as her mental health got worse, though. Kathy was moody and manic by turns. Sometimes she wanted nothing to do with me, only to cry and demand my attention. I often missed classes because I was afraid to leave her by herself, and I finally insisted that we go see a doctor. The doctor said this was normal. Her medication just needed to be adjusted. Despite their best efforts, though, the new pills and the adjustment of the old pills seemed to do no good. Our lovemaking was non-existent, despite my best efforts. I tried to comfort her, tried other means of intimacy, attended couples therapy with her, tried my best to keep her from imploding. In the end, though, it did no good. I remember the night it happened as vividly as I remember our wedding day. I was lying in bed, Kathy still in the bathroom, and I was worried about the appointment we had the next day. They planned to try her on a new battery of medications, and Kathy seemed to be willing to give it a try. She had wandered around the house like a fretful ghost all day, and I'd been keeping an eye on her until this very moment. I felt like if we could just get to bed, if we could just fall asleep in the comfortable embrace of each other's arms, everything would be fine. She climbed into bed, and something about her face didn't seem right to me. Then she opened her arms, and I was like a meteorite hurling into a planet's gravity. "I love you," she said, kissing my forehead as her heart raced against my chest. "I'll always love you." I fell asleep, wrapped in the arms of my love, sure that as long as I remained here, everything would be okay. I woke up, however, to discover that I was sleeping next to a corpse. I called the paramedics, but there was nothing they could do. She'd been dead for hours as I slept. Kathy had taken an overdose of sleeping pills before tucking in for the night. It was almost ironic in the end, and the note she had left on the nightstand told me everything I needed to know. All these years, I had believed that I was giving her the same feeling that she was giving me. It turned out, I was nothing but a thief in the night. Kathy said that her mental decline had started almost the day we met. The balance and fulfillment that I had been expecting was a mirror to the anxiety that she was feeling. She had taken my inability to stay awake as something she was doing. She was boring me. I was disinterested. She was failing as a woman as a result. The longer it lasted, the more she felt like she was the cause. She wanted to please me, to be a good wife, but the longer it went on, the more inadequate she felt. She loved me. She never wavered in her love for me. But being with someone who was physically uninterested in her was killing her, physically and emotionally. She had finally decided that if sleeping next to her was what I wanted, then she would give me what I wanted. We would both sleep soundly for a change. I'm writing this as I sit in the viewing room of the funeral parlor. They gave me an hour before her cremation, a final viewing for her grieving husband. I could tell by the way they keep looking at me that I must look terrible. I've been awake for the past 5 days, and the bags under my eyes look more like suitcases. I've become accustomed to her presence, to the way she makes me feel, and now my sleep is all but non-existent. I'm like a junkie with no smack, and my fix lies in that box across the way, looking as lovely as the day we met. I think that when I get done with this, I may climb into that simple pine box with her and see if I can find some sleep. I can almost feel whatever she possesses from my seat here, and I want to see if she still possesses it even in death. Who knows? Maybe I'll pull the lid closed behind me, and they'll simply slide me into the chute as well. It seems fitting somehow that the two of us should sleep forever, two souls. The celebration of Purga De Rata was a celebration that was highly anticipated in my town. The celebration is always capped off by the hunting of the mice, which was the highlight of the event. On the first day of the feast, we opened the door to find 3 masks attached to our doorknob. This occurred year after year for as long as I could remember, and I didn't think it was strange at all. Every year we would open the door, find the cat masks, long, wiry whiskers and pointy black ears, hanging from the doorknob to our home. There would be one for my mother, one for my father, and one for me. We would wear them at the festival, riding the rides and playing the games, lifting them only slightly to eat food at the feast as we gave praise to Saint Rocher. This year, however, was special for me. I was 13, old enough to do a day's work if I chose, old enough to have my own money and to have my own responsibilities, old enough to participate in what came after the feast, old enough to participate in the Purga De Ratas. I had always watched from the windows of the council hall with the other children as the people in the cat masks went about freeing us from the rats. You could see them sometimes, the big rats with their pointed noses and coarse whiskers, running through the streets as the cats turned them from wherever they had been hiding. I asked Mother what they were. They were larger than the rats I had seen in the pantry on occasions, and she had told me that these were the undesirables, those who Saint Rocher had chosen to purge from the community, and that it was the job of the town to become his cats and free the community of them. I asked her once if we could be chosen by Saint Rocher to be purged on that night. She told me I'd better pray it never happened. Those who were purged during the Purga De Ratas were cursed and removed from the town after they were destroyed. This was the year I would discover what that truly meant. I went to the festival in my mask, excited for the night to come. As I played the games, danced the Danza de Rata, and ate at the feast, I couldn't help but think of taking to the streets with my father and mother that night to help purge the unclean from our town. Mother had said that they were Saint Rocher's enemies, said that her father had said they were filled with spirits who had brought the plague to our city when she was a girl. If they didn't purge all of them, they would bring it there again. I was excited to go out and bring honor to my family as I drove these rats out of the city, but I was a little scared too. It was that feeling you get just before doing something dangerous and exciting, like riding a wild horse. You fear the action, but you can't wait for the ride. I was a little sad though. My friend Maria wasn't there. She never missed the festival, and not seeing her made me wonder if she was sick. Her father wasn't a nice man, my father said. He didn't support the festival, and he had tried to argue for having it canceled many times. He always seemed nice to me when I visited Maria, but I knew well enough not to argue with my father. I didn't see Maria all day, and as we went home with the setting sun, I hoped I would see her tonight. We returned home and ate at the midnight feast that my parents always ate before it was time to go to the night's work. I tucked in greedily, knowing that I would need my strength for what was to come. God help me. I was so young, I didn't know what was in store for me. As we ate, I asked my mother about the people who didn't go to the festival. She looked critically, asking what I meant. I told her I saw someone peeking through the windows of their home. They'd moved away from the window quickly, but I had marked them by their whiskers and their beady eyes. Mother said that those people were not to be trusted, and that clearly they had been infested by the spirits Saint Rocher wanted us to expel from the city that night. I nodded, making a note of that house in my mind. Their house was close to ours, and my parents and I could get there easily and chase them out. When the deep thrum of the midnight bell tolled, Father donned his mask and led us to the kitchen. There would be no need to take me to the chapel for safekeeping that night. He handed each of us a knife from the knife block, saving the sharpest knife for me. It was a long, curved fillet knife, and he told me not to be afraid to swing it hard. These aren't people anymore, and we must expunge the plague from the city. I nodded, not understanding entirely, but I soon would. We left the house, and I took them to the house I had seen earlier, seeing the other cats as they moved through the city. They were moving in clusters, groups of 5 or 10, and soon we would be taken into the Clouder easily. The other cats around me were a comfortable weight, all of them people I knew, though I didn't know that I knew them. They followed us as we went, letting us lead them to the rats. The lights were off when we approached, the house dark and the windows shuttered. I figured this would be the time that we would scare the mice out of their holes. I'd seen my kitten, Georgette, scare mice out of their holes before. She would pretend to be interested in one hole, and then when the mice would poke their heads out of the other hole and come hesitantly out, she would dash at them and scare them out of the house. She would run them and run them. Her little kitten energy was boundless, until Mother finally saw them, swept them out with her broom, crying "Purga De Rata" as she swept them from our house. But we were no kittens, it seems, and this city did not hunt like that. The stone made me jump when it crashed through the window. The window shattered inward, and I heard someone shriek. We had scared the rats, and now they would come running out. But this was also how kittens hunted. Several of the cats, the ones with clubs as well as knives, cleared the glass out of the window and climbed through easily. The shrieks from inside were undoubtedly more human than mouse-like, but when the door burst open, one of the rats ran for it, just like the rats at home. No broom came out to sweep him away. The clouder fell on him, and I saw his hands come up to reach as the knives came down. I stopped as I saw what they were doing, feeling a little sick, as I saw the blood leaking from the rat. He was bigger than I had expected, bigger than me, and he twitched as he lay there. I took a step back, not really wanting to get close, but my mother pushed me forward as her hands stopped my retreat. I looked back into her cat mask and saw her gentle eyes as she pushed me again. "Go on, honey. Get a cut in." I stepped forward, some of my excitement dulled by fear, and saw the gurgling rat looking up at me as it bled onto the cobbles. Its black eyes stared at me, and it coughed wetly, though its lips didn't move. I held my knife in a shaky hand, preparing to strike, when the rat suddenly reached out for me, locking its hand around my ankles. My fear gripped me, and I suddenly stabbed out with the knife. I stabbed the rat again and again and again, closing my eyes as I stabbed his arm, his back, his neck. The hand went limp as he flopped onto the cobbles. The clouder cheered, and we were off again. We ran, drunk off our own power, and found a pair of rats in the street as they dodged another group. They were cutting down an alley as we came upon them, but they looked up at our group as it came close. One of them took off down the alley, but the other just stood there, frozen in terror as the clouder fell on her. She screamed as we stabbed her, but I broke off to pursue the other one as they finished stabbing and beating her. I didn't want her to get away, and my blood was up. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want one of the rats for myself, too. I ran after her, leaving the others behind, and found her just as she hit the wall of the alley. She turned, seeing me, and started looking around fitfully. I could almost taste her fear as I closed in, knife at the ready. I, too, would purge my town of rats. "Please," she begged, and her words gave me pause. She was speaking. Did rats speak? None of the rats I'd ever seen spoke. Of course, none of the rats I had ever seen were big either. The speaking rat made me falter for a moment, and she took full advantage of this as she tried to reason with me. Please don't hurt me. I'll give you whatever you want. I just don't want to die." I heard the clouder coming up behind me, yelling as they came, and their presence gave me strength. I ran forward, and I shoved the knife at her, the blade sinking into her abdomen as she tried to back away. As it went in, I yelled, "Purga De Rata!" and I could see her dress starting to redden as her hands gripped the knife. She cut her fingers, and she fell to her knees as the clouder came into the alley with a shout of mirth. I pulled the knife out and ran to my father. He pulled me into his arms and whispered, "You're a natural." At that moment, I was so proud. My family was doing something special, and we were united. Sometimes it almost felt like we lived on our own, only seeing each other for dinner. But now we were doing something we could all enjoy, and I couldn't wait till next year. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was doing, but I would soon find out. I followed the clouder, growing bolder as we went, until we came to the next house. They pounded on the door, yelling for the rats to come out and face their fate. Everyone else was waiting expectantly, waiting for the door to open so they could charge the house and kill these rats. I was confused, though. There must have been a mistake. This couldn't be the rats' house. They were looking for rocks to break the window, but I just shook my head and felt my confusion mount. This couldn't be the right house. This was Maria's house. The door opened suddenly, and Maria's father stepped out onto the stoop. He wasn't wearing a mask. His face was set in a stoic cast, and he raised his rifle and pointed it at the mob. Some of them backed away, but most of them only seemed to take more pleasure from his presence. They mumbled to themselves, gripping their knives and preparing to charge. Maria's father cast his gaze around at them, his eyes falling on me for a moment before sliding away. "I'm not wearing that damn mask. This whole celebration is an abomination. If you mean to take my family, then you can come and try. I'll take a few of you with me. Just remember, which of you will be wearing a rat mask next year?" I backed away from the clouder, slowly, my knife hitting the cobbles. No one noticed the metallic sound, or the scream that followed it as the rifle blammed loudly. One of the cats had charged him, thinking he wouldn't shoot, and now he lay bleeding on his doorstep. The gun went off again a moment later, but I didn't see who had been killed that time. I was running, head down, my mask forgotten, as I turned from the carnage that I now understood was not a magic festival or a fight for our town from giant rats. We were killing our friends, our neighbors, and I would never understand why. I ran as the tears streamed down my face, and I didn't stop running until the sounds of rats and cats were behind me. I ran until the woods enveloped me, the lush fairy tale woods that seemed to surround our home. The trees whipped at me, the roots pulled at me, and I just kept running. I ran from the horror, from the chaos, and I didn't stop until the ground went out from under me. Suddenly I was tumbling, I was rolling down something, and I put my hands up to my face to protect myself. I was so confused, so frightened, and when I hit my head on something, my vision got very blurry. I kept rolling, struggling to maintain my consciousness. I was slapping against the bushes and banging against small rocks, and when I finally came to a rest, I felt warm, solid ground beneath me. When the lights engulfed me, leaving me in a warm circle, I passed out. I woke up in a hospital. The nurses said I had been found lying on a major highway, a truck driver having brought me here after calling the police. I had been unconscious for a while, a day at least, and I had a pretty massive head wound that would need to heal. The doctor said I had a small skull fracture, and that I definitely had a concussion. They kept me for a month, most of which was trying to get me to tell them who I was and where I was from. I feigned memory loss. The women in Mother's books lost their memories sometimes after an accident. I did not want to go back home. I knew for a fact that if I went home, after running away from the festival, that my family might very well find rat masks on their door next year. I also didn't want to face the wrath of my parents and my community. No one refused to participate in the festival, or, like Maria's father, they were made to play the rats. After a month, I was sent to an orphanage where I was adopted. The country I'm from doesn't have the best track record when it comes to placing children into foster homes, or even having them adopted by good families, but I suppose I got lucky. Glenda and Mark were from the United States, here to do missionary work. When Glenda heard about my story, she became interested in me. She said that it seemed to be God's will that she help me, and they adopted me right then and there. They stayed for a few years, helping me get back on my feet, and when they went home, they helped me gain citizenship, become a United States citizen. I moved with them to San Diego and attended college. I never told them about my village, or the Purga De Rata, and they never pushed me. I think they suspected that my amnesia was self-inflicted, and they're honestly the best parents I ever could have asked for. I'm 30 now, married with a new baby in a place of my own. My husband, Marco, is a wonderful father, and we couldn't be happier. He works as a civil engineer for a large company, and I work as a nurse when I'm not at home with Hugo. Glenda and Mark, my mom and dad, are always welcome at our house, and I can't imagine a better life than the one I have. A life that my past is threatening to take away. You see, when I went to get the mail today, I noticed something hanging on the door of our apartment. I saw the masks, laughing and thinking it was a Halloween thing from the neighbors. But when I picked them up, the wiry whiskers stuck painfully into my hand. I dropped them and stared in horror. They were masks, all right. 3 of them, and they all were gray lacquered faces of rats. The whiskers were frayed metal wires, and the nose of one had been broken in the fall, a delicate black bulb that now lay on the pavement beside the mask. There were 3 masks, as I said, and the third was the one that filled me with the most dread. 2 were normal-sized, easily capable of fitting an adult face, but the third was small, delicate, the eyes carved to make it look scared and sad. A mask for a baby. There was a note inside one, and I thought I would tear it as my shaking hands reached out to open it. The paper was rough, handmade, and the ink was thick and blocky. The village made its own paper, its own ink, and rarely traded with others. I had no doubt that the masks had been made by the same old man that used to make them every year. I felt the tears come on, and as I read the note, the concrete bit into my knees as I went down to them to sob into the paper. The note read, "Joyous Purga Rinvadaro. Join us this evening for the Purga De Ratas. If you cannot attend, don't worry. We will bring the celebration to you."